The wind had been screaming across the valley for 3 hours straight. Not the kind of wind that rattles windows and bends tree branches. This was the kind of wind that makes grown men stop walking and question every decision that led them to this mountain. Snow drove sideways through the pine trees like a white curtain being torn in half, swallowing footprints almost the instant they appeared. The temperature had already plunged to -22 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was still dropping. The mountain rescue team knew one thing above all else. Every single minute mattered now. A missing hiker had been reported nearly 12 hours earlier. 12 hours in weather like this. You don't need to be a survival expert to understand what that means. The human body, no matter how strong, no matter how well prepared, begins to shut itself down after prolonged exposure to cold. First the fingers, then the feet, then the deeper things, the slow, creeping fog in the mind that makes people believe they're actually warm, when in reality they're dying. If he was still out there somewhere in that darkness, the mountain was already winning. 2 police trucks sat at the trailhead, their emergency lights slicing faint ribbons of red and blue through the blowing snow. Officers in heavy winter gear moved quickly between the vehicles and the tree line, bending over maps and radios, dividing up the search grid, shouting coordinates over the howl of the wind. There was urgency in their voices, not panic, but the kind of controlled intensity that tells you these people understand what's at stake. And at the center of it all stood a large German shepherd named Ranger. Now, Ranger was no ordinary dog. He had been trained specifically for mountain search and rescue operations, one of only a handful of dogs in the entire region certified for high-altitude, extreme weather deployment. He had located lost hikers before. He had found avalanche victims buried so deep that no human searcher could have reached them in time. He had once tracked an injured climber across 4 miles of ice field in a whiteout storm, guided only by a scent thread thinner than a whisper. But tonight, something about Ranger's behavior was different. Different in a way that made even his experienced handler pause. The dog had frozen completely still, staring into the dark wall of the forest ahead, ears stiff, body locked, as if something invisible was calling to him from the trees. And then, without any warning, a young girl standing quietly near the edge of the search team raised her hand and gave the dog a small, almost invisible signal. What happened next would leave everyone standing in that clearing completely stunned. Stay with us, because this story gets stranger and more incredible with every passing minute. Before we continue, make sure you hit like and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I'm always amazed at how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to that mountain. The wind continued to tear across the ridge as Officer Grant Miller crouched beside Ranger and checked the dog's harness one final time. Grant was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cut hair and the kind of calm face that comes from years of working in situations where calm is the only thing standing between order and disaster. He had been a K9 handler for 9 of his 15 years on the force. He knew Ranger better than most people knew their closest friends. And right now, Grant was watching his dog behave in a way he had never seen before. Ranger wasn't just alert. He wasn't just focused. He was vibrating with something. A tension so deep it seemed to radiate through the leash into Grant's gloved hand. The dog's eyes were fixed on one specific point at the edge of the forest. His ears hadn't moved in almost 30 seconds. His breathing was slow and deliberate in a way that seemed almost unnatural for an animal standing in freezing air. "Easy, boy," Grant said softly, laying a hand on the dog's back. Ranger didn't even flinch. The other officers were clustered near the second truck, studying a topographic map under a flashlight. The lead coordinator, Sergeant Hayes, was marking off grid sections with a pen, his voice barely audible over the gusting wind. They had divided the surrounding forest into 8 zones. They would sweep them in order, moving from the most likely areas toward the less probable ones. It was methodical. It was the right way to do it. But Ranger wasn't interested in zones. He was interested in one specific patch of trees, and he had been staring at it for nearly 4 full minutes now. Grant frowned. He pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line. Shadows jumped and shifted between the pines. Snow spiraled through the beam like static on an old television screen. Nothing. No movement. No sign of anything beyond the dark geometry of branches and trunks. Still, Ranger did not look away. That was when the girl finally moved. Her name was Emily. She was 11 years old, and she had been standing beside the second police truck for close to 45 minutes. Long enough that most of the officers had simply stopped noticing her. She was wrapped in an oversized dark green winter coat, her boots disappearing into the snow up to the ankle, her breath forming soft clouds in the frozen air. To anyone who glanced at her, she looked like a child who had wandered too close to an active rescue scene. Maybe the daughter of one of the officers. Maybe a curious kid from one of the nearby mountain cabins. But Emily wasn't watching the lights. She wasn't watching the officers moving around with their radios and their maps. She was watching Ranger. She had been watching Ranger since the moment the police trucks arrived. Because Emily understood something that most of the adults in that clearing did not. Her father, James Caldwell, had spent 12 years training search and rescue dogs before a sudden illness took him away 3 years ago. Growing up, Emily had spent nearly every weekend of her childhood sitting on the edges of training fields, watching her father work. She had learned the difference between a dog that was restless and a dog that was focused. She had learned what it looked like when an animal was simply nervous versus when it had caught a genuine scent and was fighting every instinct to chase it. She had learned the signals, not just the commands the handlers used. The deeper signals, the posture, the ear position, the tail angle, the subtle freeze. The specific way a trained search dog communicated with its handler when words were impossible. And she had also learned one other thing. One thing her father had taught her quietly, late one evening after a long training session, as they sat together in the grass watching the sun go down. He had leaned close and shown her a hand signal, 2 fingers raised at a specific angle, a gentle flick of the wrist. "This one," he'd said quietly, "is a release signal. It tells the search dog that the handler is ready, that it's safe to commit to the scent." Some dogs need that confirmation before they'll fully commit, especially in high-stress conditions. It's rare, but it works. Emily had practiced it for years, by habit, by memory. She had never thought she would actually use it in the field. But right now, watching Ranger strain and freeze and stare with every muscle in his body locked toward that tree line, she understood exactly what she was seeing. The dog had caught something, a scent. Possibly the missing man, but something was holding him back. Some hesitation, some signal he was waiting for that hadn't come. Emily stepped forward slowly, her boots crunching softly through the top layer of snow. Ranger turned his head. His dark eyes found her immediately, as if he had already known she was there. The world seemed to hold its breath. The wind dropped, just for a moment, just enough, and Emily raised her hand. 2 fingers, a slow, deliberate angle, a small flick of the wrist. Ranger's entire body transformed in an instant. Every muscle stiffened. His ears snapped forward like 2 radar dishes locking onto a signal. His head dropped slightly, and his weight shifted forward onto his front paws. And then he barked. One single bark, sharp and explosive, cutting across the clearing like a gunshot. Officer Grant spun around. He had never, in 3 years of working with Ranger, heard the dog bark like that unprompted, without a command. Not once. Ranger! But the dog was already moving. He lunged forward so hard that the leash snapped tight and nearly pulled Grant off his feet. Grant stumbled, regained his footing, and found himself being physically dragged toward the tree line. The other officers turned at the commotion. "What's happening?" Sergeant Hayes called out. "He's got something," Grant shouted back. His voice carried a mixture of confusion and sudden, electric hope. Because Grant knew that reaction. He had seen it before on training days on previous searches. That surge of movement, that full-body commitment, that total absorption in a single direction. Ranger had caught a scent. But that was almost impossible. In a storm this severe, with winds moving this fast, scent dispersal should have made tracking nearly impossible. The conditions weren't just bad. They were the kind of conditions that professional handlers used as examples of when not to deploy a tracking dog. because the chances of picking up a viable scent trail in a whiteout were considered too low to be reliable. Grant hesitated for just one heartbeat. Then he unclipped the leash. "Go find," he said. Ranger was gone before the words had fully left his mouth. The dog exploded into the trees, snow erupting in a white spray behind him as his powerful legs drove him forward through the drifts. The officers grabbed flashlights and ran. Branches whipped at their faces and arms as they pushed into the dark forest, fighting through snow that rose to their knees in the deeper drifts. Ranger moved with absolute certainty. No hesitation, no circling, no backtracking. Just a straight, purposeful line through the trees as if he were following a road only he could see. 1 minute passed, then 2. The officers struggled to keep up, their flashlights cutting ragged yellow tunnels through the darkness. The wind shrieked overhead in the treetops, but down on the forest floor it was slightly calmer, the pines blocking the worst of the gusts. Then suddenly Ranger stopped. He stood completely still beside a massive mound of snow at the base of a fallen pine tree. The drift was enormous, easily 5 feet high at its peak, sculpted smooth by the wind into a shape that could have been mistaken for a natural feature of the landscape. Ranger barked once. Then he began digging. Fast and furious, snow flying in every direction as his front paws tore through the frozen crust with a sound like tearing fabric. Grant dropped to his knees beside the dog. "What is it, boy? What have you got?" He began brushing snow aside with his gloved hands, moving quickly, following the path Ranger's paws had already broken through the top layer. 6 inches down. 8, 10. Then his fingers caught something that wasn't snow. He pulled his hand back and stared. A piece of dark blue fabric, frozen stiff at the edges, half buried in the compacted snow, but unmistakably artificial. Unmistakably human. Grant's heart lurched into his throat. "Help me dig," he shouted. 3 officers were beside him in seconds. Together they pulled away snow in great armloads, working as fast as they could without risking injury to whoever was beneath. Ranger stepped back and watched them, panting, his eyes fixed on the spot with an intensity that hadn't diminished at all. 15 seconds of digging. 20. And then a hand appeared. A human hand, pale and motionless, fingers slightly curled, resting in the hollow space beneath the drift where the fallen tree had created just enough shelter to keep the snow from crushing inward completely. "We've got him," Grant bellowed. The rescue team erupted into motion. Within seconds they had uncovered a man in his mid-40s, wearing a dark blue hiking jacket now crusted with ice along every seam. His face was pale, the kind of pale that sits at the border between survival and something worse. His lips had taken on a faint bluish tinge. His eyelids were closed. One officer pressed 2 fingers against his neck and held them there. The entire forest seemed to wait. Then, "He's got a pulse. It's weak, but it's there. He's alive." The words hit the clearing like a wave. 2 of the officers actually let out involuntary sounds, something between a laugh and a gasp. Grant sat back in the snow and pressed his hands to his face for just a moment, breathing hard. Alive, buried under 3 feet of wind-packed snow, a body temperature that had almost certainly dropped into critical hypothermia territory. Having survived nearly 13 hours in one of the most brutal storms the mountain had seen all winter, alive, they wrapped him in emergency thermal blankets, moving carefully and quickly, monitoring his breathing as they transferred him to a rescue sled. The radio crackled as Sergeant Hayes called ahead to the ambulance waiting at the trailhead. As the team worked, Ranger sat quietly beside them, no longer digging, no longer barking, simply present, watching with those steady, dark eyes as the humans did the work that only humans could finish. Grant reached over and placed a hand on the dog's head. "Good boy," he said softly. But even as he said it, something was turning over quietly in his mind. Because the timing didn't add up. Ranger had reacted, that explosive, committed, undeniable reaction before they had entered the forest. Before the dog had been anywhere near the drift. Before any of the standard deployment commands had been given. What had triggered him? Grant turned and looked back through the trees, toward the distant glow of the emergency lights at the trailhead, toward where the girl had been standing. When the rescue team finally emerged from the forest, nearly 50 minutes had passed since they'd entered. The storm had weakened to something manageable. Snow still fell, but gently now, the kind of snowfall that looks peaceful when it isn't trying to kill you. The ambulance had already left, moving carefully down the mountain road with the rescued hiker. And Emily was still there, standing beside the truck, watching Ranger. Grant walked toward her slowly, brushing snow from his jacket, his flashlight still in his hand. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "You gave him a signal." Emily looked up at him. She didn't look surprised that he had noticed. She nodded once. "My dad used to train search and rescue dogs," she said. "For years. I watched him work almost every weekend growing up." She paused, glancing toward Ranger. Ranger had the scent, I could tell, but he was holding back, waiting for confirmation, waiting for his handler to release him. She looked back at Grant. "You were busy with the other officers." He needed something. Grant was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the dog, then back at the girl. "Your father taught you that signal?" Emily nodded again. "He said you never know when knowing it might matter." Grant turned that over slowly. He thought about the timing, about that single bark cutting across the clearing, about Ranger exploding toward the tree line with a certainty that had pulled him off his feet, about the man now in the back of an ambulance with a weak but steady pulse. "Well," he said finally, his voice low and quiet beneath the softly falling snow, "tonight, that signal saved a man's life." Emily didn't say anything for a moment. Then she knelt down beside Ranger, wrapped her arms around the big dog's neck, and held on. Ranger leaned into her, heavy, warm, entirely calm. As snowflakes settled on both of them like something out of a story you'd tell a child at bedtime, except this one was real. Sometimes the difference between a person surviving and not surviving comes down to moments so small they barely register. A slight shift in the wind, a piece of blue fabric half an inch above the surface of the snow, a girl who paid attention, a father who passed something down, a dog who knew how to listen. Emily never planned to be part of that rescue. She was just a child standing near a search that wasn't hers, watching a dog she recognized, drawing on knowledge she'd absorbed years ago from someone she loved and lost. And yet that small, quiet gesture, 2 fingers raised in a freezing mountain clearing, was the precise thing that moved the chain of events forward at the exact moment it needed to move. We talk a lot about the extraordinary things that save lives, the helicopters, the technology, the training, and those things matter enormously. But sometimes it's the small things that tip the balance, the things that look, from the outside, like nothing at all. If you felt something watching this story today, share it with someone. You never know who needs to hear it. And if you're still here, consider subscribing, because we have more stories just like this one. Stories where ordinary moments turn out to be anything but.